It does seem odd. It just doesn't make sense that it'd be a real Ukraine effort. It sounds more like a false flag. But even why does Putin feel he needs to do a false flag? It's all mysterious. And I have to say, here on the street in Washington, everyone is puzzled. There's just no answer yet.
And maybe it must be that, we've had a lot of talk about this offensive and counter-offensive, haven't we? It's been a long time coming. It's been called a spring offensive. We're already in May. Is it because Putin may know that a bloody and tough part of the war is coming and he wants to galvanize something in return?
I think it's something similar to that. I really do. I think he's trying to have the Russian people rally around the flag in some ways. I think he's presenting himself as someone who could have been assassinated, someone who was on the target list for Ukraine, a victim of this war, if you will, and I'm stoking that nationalist fervor in Russia to rally around the flag, rally around the president, and maybe that's how he's going to deal with the fallout of the offensive when it happens, is he's stirring it up.
One question I suppose would be, if the Ukrainians did decide to go after Putin, if there was an attack on Russian soil, which there may have been a couple over the last year or so, where they've gone after ammunition dumps that appear to be in Russia. But if they were to make a step to fight on Russian soil, to even go after Putin, would that change America's relationship with Ukraine?
Well, yeah, I think it's a red line for the administration as far as not wanting to have an escalation caused by Ukraine doing something spectacular like this. I mean, you're right, there have been strikes in Crimea, which of course is still Ukrainian, even though it's occupied, but the bombings, etc., that have been out there. But something spectacular like this, I think Ukraine knows that would not help things in Washington, particularly right before this offensive begins. So that's one of the reasons it doesn't make sense to me that it would be Ukraine doing it. They would have more to lose and not a chance, really, not a good chance of getting at their target using just two
Yeah.
drones. And not only that, but Putin doesn't sleep in the Kremlin. He sleeps elsewhere. So this just doesn't make sense.
Where are we on Ukrainian membership of NATO? Because that's been long discussed. And there's presumably at some point, we're now looking at a war that could go 2 or 3 years. If Ukraine joins NATO within that time, does that change the relationship of everyone? Because ultimately, if you are a NATO country, then it's one for all and all for one. What happens then?
That's the issue because to join the alliance, you've got to have a consensus. All the allies have to be part of this and have to agree. And I think your question about so what happens then is what will keep Ukraine from coming into NATO, at least right now. I mean, certainly Hungary wouldn't agree to have Ukraine in the alliance. Maybe some of the older allies wouldn't want them in right now either because of escalation, etc. So I think it's exactly your question, which will keep it from happening, is all for one for all at a situation right now with Russia might be a bit too much for some allies who aren't doing as much as they maybe should do because they feel that this is something that's going to be some downsides for them, and so they're not going to be willing to vote to bring Ukraine into the alliance as well. So I think that's what's going to keep them out, at least at this stage.
So
Is
again,
exactly your question.
yeah. So again, that does point to this potential for a sort of prolonged status quo, doesn't it? That if the Ukrainians don't kick Russia out with one big sweep in the next few months, which I think must be considered unlikely, if not impossible, but unlikely at least. And the movement to join NATO is really contingent on the war being over, because otherwise it risks escalation of all the NATO member states. There is a sense, is there not? I'm interested in your thoughts on how optimistic you feel that the long haul that's been much feared, we could be setting ourselves up for now for the next couple of years.
We could very well be, and we do have to face that. Wars take a long time, as the UK knows. I mean, my God, looking back on World War II, World War One for the UK, you all know it better than anyone else. So I think we have to gird our loins for this. This is going to be hard. We're going to have to be supportive and providing assistance for a long time coming, and it's not going to be a one-shot deal. This offensive, it's not going to look like last summer, where there was a lot of movement on the ground with Ukraine forces going in and chasing the Russians away. The Russians have dug in, and this is going to take a long time to dig them out. So this will be an offensive, but there'll be a one after this and another one after this as well. The Russians are going to come back as well with more forces. So we're in a long slog, and we've just got to be ready for that and know that Ukraine will need our assistance at every step of the way.
And politically in the US, obviously it's an election year next year, as it is here. But I suspect here there is such consensus, at the moment at least, around supporting Ukraine that it's not going to be much of a partisan issue. Is Biden rock solid on this? Do you think the Republicans will be rock solid on this? I presume it depends whether it's Trump or someone else, but we don't actually know, do we?
We really don't, and I'm afraid this will become a issue in the presidential elections. Normally, foreign policy issues are not. It's usually domestic, and as you know, with the U.S. right now, it's culture wars and that type of thing. But I think this is going to be this the support for Ukraine is going to be molded into a domestic issue by the Republicans, by Trump himself. If in fact he's the Republican nominee, and even if he's not, I think that's the Republican playbook. So we're gonna, as far as the Democrats and the present administration is concerned, they're gonna have to develop a narrative that the American people can really understand and throw their weight behind in terms of why we're supporting Ukraine now and why we need to continue to do that even into a second administration. And right now, there hasn't been so much of a narrative along those lines yet. But they're going to have to face up to it because I can see this becoming a political issue in the campaign, and there needs to be a proper response to that by the Democrats.
So we're facing uncertain times. I think it's fair to say that the year does feel like an uncertain period for Ukraine's defense, Russia's attack, and how those two things sort of come against one another.
Well, that's exactly right, and I think that's what Putin is banking on. If politics in the U.S. can turn against Ukraine for whatever reason, that's what Putin is expecting to happen. And if it happens in the U.S., it could catch into Europe as well. So I think one of the pages from Putin's playbook is to buy time, play for time, and wait for the West to dissolve in terms of their support for Ukraine. And political leadership in the West has got to prevent that from happening.